Welcome to this episode of Reaching Minds, Thoughts for Your Life Journey. Today we will be exploring the question and the area of action learning questions, the methodology, their benefits and challenges, both for individuals and in organizational contexts. We will also be delving into the origin and the principle of action learning, including its relevance for addressing complex problems, gaining personal insights, and connections between coaching, mentoring, and action learning. Now, for us to do this, I'm joined by Dr. Richard Hale, who is the co-founder of
Know, Can, Will, Do
Action Learning Network and creator of the Action Learning Question methodology. Richard is a member of the London Advisory Board for York St John University and supervisor with Hult Ashfish Doctorate in Organisational Change. Now, Richard introduced action learning questions methods over 25 years ago for governments and commercial businesses internationally. And he's partnered in several business schools as well. He regularly publishes, because I've seen loads of his work, in the field of learning, relationships, and action learning. Richard's doctorate research was under the supervision of Professor Alan Mumford of Learning Style. Renan explored the nature of learning relationships, including coaching, mentoring, and action learning. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you very much, Nita, and that's a great introduction to have. I'm very flattered that you've kind of looked into the background and the history that I've been sort of part of, and will share a bit of that and very much bring it up to date in terms of looking at how action learning is relevant to the problems and challenges that we face in organizations right now.
Exactly that. And now I think I might have shared with you that I came across action learning in the mid-80s, going through a process. And I know that it was probably, when I look back on it, the way it was done was very different to your approach now, I think. And so I'm really excited about listening to how this essential way of doing things makes a great impact, both for individuals and in organizations. So my kind of first question is, what's the kind of relevance and benefits of action learning question approach for those who may not be familiar with action learning?
Okay, well, it's a great question. And, you raise an important point in talking about your own prior experience of action learning, being a particular version of it. And it originated with somebody called Reg Revans. We'll talk a bit more about him. But he was kind of reluctant to give us very specific and tight definition of it. But he certainly created a movement which allowed a number of people in the world of learning, development, organizational change to experiment and try different approaches to using action learning. I developed a particular approach called action learning questions. We'll talk more about that. But to answer your question about the relevance of action learning, for me, it's about the fact that we have a method to enable people in organizations to collaborate and to learn together through tackling what I would describe as intractable problems or challenges. In other words, there's not an obvious method for tackling them. You can go to AI and it won't actually give you the correct answer, because there isn't one correct answer, because we're dealing with problems rather than puzzles. And the mistake often I see being made, and I see it particularly at the moment with the seduction of AI, is that we are trying to tackle complex social and technical and economic problems, which are all mixed up with all those factors. So they are problems which we need to turn into questions, but we're trying to tackle them like they're a puzzle. In other words, there must be a correct answer. Maybe AI can tell us what that answer is. So why is it relevant today? Action learning is relevant because it is a method to enable us to practically learn through working on real world challenges. And if you want a kind of very recent example, if we look at the crisis with the global pandemic, what I noticed in the early stages of the pandemic was there was a lot of pressure from the public, from different people put upon politicians, put upon the scientists to give us the solution and the answer. And of course, there was the medical solution that was clinical solution that was, we were all hoping would come through. But actually, it became a multifaceted challenge. It wasn't just medical. And there wasn't going to be a date when we could say, this is when we will find the answer out, as though it's a project that we can project manage our way through. If you look at when the breakthroughs came, I think they came when people said, we don't know when we're going to have the solution. We don't know the answer, and we're experimenting. So we're piloting various things. We're collaborating across countries. The politicians are even admitting that they don't know. Journalists are kind of now starting to accept that. The public are starting to accept that. We're all in this together. So we're going to make the breakthroughs through what would be, I would say, a kind of action learning type approaches. In other words, admitting we don't know, collaborating and across disciplines and across professions and across countries, taking action, trying to do something and experimenting and seeing what happens, and then learning together. So, that's to me why, it is really relevant today. Now, the challenge is we're not in the middle of a pandemic, thankfully, but we're now in the middle of a big kind of buzz around AI. And I see us progressing, if you like, from a point where a lot of people are saying, well, I think I know what the answers are in terms of AI. Working with a group of senior technical people in a conference recently, where at the end, the keynote speaker was asked, okay, what is your kind of big recommendation and suggestion? What should we be doing? Had the courage to actually say, I don't know. And I thought, great, that's a breakthrough, because action learning is about starting from a position of not knowing and then bringing people together to problem solve, but learn through the process. And it requires some courage in a very professionalized type environment that we work in to say, I don't really know. So therefore, we work with questioning rather than just seeking the answers from either the books on the shelf, the subject matter experts, ChatGPT.
Exactly. And I think as you're talking, I'm thinking about the whole process. As you're saying, it's about starting from not knowing. It's also about, with your COVID example and your example you're giving just now, is the concept of multiple truths as well. The value around through the questioning is you can have different truths, different perspectives, and as you're saying, is that there isn't one we can say this is the right way. And you're right that we can put a question in AI and it gives us a perspective, but it's not the only perspective that is around. There are other perspectives that can, and that's really powerful. But I'm wondering, in a world, Richard, that is about quick fixes, do people have the patience to sort of bear with the not knowing and to not look for the easy answer or the straightforward answer?
A lot of people don't. And so what they do is they either kind of seek the quick fix. And, if you look at something like LinkedIn, it's a kind of hotbed for people who are either kind of looking for the quick fix or people who are claiming to have the quick fix. So, they're claiming to know the answers. Quite often those answers have been culled from an AI app anyway. And there's a kind of whole, load of noise going on around that. It depends on really what your objective is. If you're in an organization, whether it's your own business, or whether it's a corporate or it's a public sector organization, and you want to make a difference and you want to, influence positive change, that suggests, that we need to embrace the idea that change requires, an element of risk. It requires an element of research. It requires action. And yes, your point about multiple truths is a good one, I think. Did a lot of work with a number of scientists or people from a scientific background over the last sort of few years and introduced the action learning question method to them. If I was to generalize, initially, they loved the idea of debating and discussing a problem in search of the truth and would often get stuck in, I use the metaphor of sky, ground, and underground. And sky is kind of theory and models and frameworks, which are kind of drawn from various sources. Ground is dealing with our organizational problem or our challenge that's right in front of us. And underground is kind of what's going on, without it being obvious, but it's really important. So it's around values, behaviors, culture, power dynamics, those sorts of things. So it's a useful metaphor to help people kind of do their kind of work on an action learning question. So back to the scientists, they would love the discussion that was in the sky around the research and other people's research, and they would often get stuck in the sky.
In their hands.
Yeah. And they would kind of collude to sort of, have this intellectual debate, and struggle with actually going from thinking into, or even thinking and decision, into action. So with action learning, you have to go that far. You can't just do the intellectual piece. And you have to kind of hang loose really about, is there going to be one truth? If you're dealing with a multifaceted problem, let's say it's to do with how do I, or how do we in our organization influence more effective ways of working? And how do we work with 5 generations in the workplace or not in the workplace? They're working, in a hybrid way. That's an example of a multifaceted problem. There's not one truth because different people will have different sort of views and values that influence their thinking about this. So we do have to kind of accept that we're collaborating, we're doing some research to find out other people's truths in order to be able to make some good decisions and then take some action to experiment, to try something out, through the action learning. And in my case, the action learning question method, where you create a question, you agree it, you research it, you take action, and then you learn from it. It's quite different to what I would suggest is training or teaching, which is often about, there is a known truth, there is a known way, and there is a particular theory that needs to be applied. It is different to that, and it requires a different mindset. You're absolutely right to accept the idea of even the concept of there being multiple truths.
And I guess it's also in posing the question, Richard, there's a sense around waiting to see what emerges from yourself and also from your peers who might be prodding you, thinking, oh, have you thought about this and have you thought about that? It's the ambiguity and uncertainty because we're not having a quick answer with it. And people are, from my experience of running action learning sets, one of the things I do frame right at the beginning is, which people get really tempted by, is to give others advice. And I'll go, that's really off the table. It isn't something, if you're working with a group of people that you're familiar with, I reinforce that all the time. I guess the thing around action learning, which is similar to, I'm making the connection around when you're coaching someone, is that you're really asking that person to come up with the answer themselves with some assistance, with some support, rather than, hand over. So for me, there is a parallel process or a connection between what I would do as a coach, rather than say, hey, here's the answer. We would explore that through the questions that I would ask. What's your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. The challenge of wanting to be helpful by giving solutions or suggestions early is a common thing, and it's to do with, I think, how people are conditioned, particularly if we're working in a professionalized type environment or throughout all of one's career, conditioned and trained to develop expertise and to be able to then use it. And if you're naturally wanting to be helpful for other people with respect to their problems, often the tendency is to jump in and say, well, yeah, I had a similar problem, and when I encountered it, this is what I did, or I think I know what you need to do. So early on, it does maybe feel like you're slowing the process down to actually say, let's understand and let's allow the problem holder, whether it's an individual or a team or a group, to explore and understand what their challenge is. And they frame it as a question. So we help them do that framing of the question, but they frame it and they own the question. And this is the action learning question method. They then own it and have some responsibility to work with it. But, this idea of trading our ignorance, working with our ignorance is what it's about. And sometimes it does mean going slower in order to go fast. And, that idea, it originated in action learning terms way back in the 1930s with the Cavendish laboratories and Rutherford, who was leading a research group, and Reg Revans, the creator of action learning, was part of that group. There were 9 Nobel Prize winning scientists around the room trying to tackle science challenges of atomic physics of the day. Made, obviously, as we know, massive breakthroughs with that. But it came from Rutherford saying, leave your Nobel Prize at the door and your expertise at the door and come in for these Wednesday sessions. And we don't want to hear you talking about your own knowledge and wisdom. We want you to discuss what you don't know and to work with that. Revans took that idea, he was influenced by Einstein, who also sort of said, if you think you understand the problem, make sure you're not deceiving yourself. And so he took all these kind of messages from his science training, education, and experience into business, and that came into the coal industry, which was on its knees post-war, the health service, early days of it, and problems in the London hospitals, same sort of challenges that we see now, and elsewhere. So, basically, it's a fundamental aspect or value of action learning that you described there. But it is so easy to slip into supposedly asking a question, but it's a leading question like, have you thought about doing X, Y, Z? And even facilitators that we're training and developing through the action learning facilitator accreditation, who are quite far through it, catch themselves doing that themselves. And I believe it's because, of the strength of our prior conditioning about learning and about professionalism. So we have to kind of learn some stuff.
I agree with you. And isn't there a concept around which, if I can get this right, often we ask the questions of the answers we want to hear, something like that. And I think I've certainly seen it myself, you ask a question and you go, why am I asking that question? I'm probably asking it because it's an interest to me rather than the other person. And the other thing what you were just saying provoked in me is I was listening to a webinar yesterday. I can't remember the name of but anyway, what it sort of brought up for me again, and you've mentioned it, is to think slow to go fast. And it made me think about, system 2 thinking, which is really around us, rather than working on our habitual automatic ways of doing things, is really slowing down and almost pausing and asking ourselves to stay in that space, which can be uncomfortable because, as you said, it's the unknown, isn't it? It's the unknown for us. And I'm a great proponent of system 2 thinking when I apply it. And of course, that's one of the links again with coaching, is that when we're coaching, and I guess there are some parallels with action learning, is that we're not asking a leading question either, because the whole process is in coaching that the client's always in charge rather than you as a coach. And I guess it's the same one when someone is asking that inquiry, that question, posing that question, they're in charge. And the people around them, the question they ask is to help their inquiry rather than help the person who's asking the question. I hope that makes sense.
Great, you raised a number of points there. They certainly make sense. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, your first point really about, do we kind of gravitate or gear our questions towards our own interests, is a really good point. And I think that, it's the knowledge mapping method that I was referring to, of taking your question, exploring it in terms of sky, ground, and underground.
Yeah.
It's in an action learning context. What I encourage people to do is to do that knowledge mapping, actually literally create a map and keywords on it. If you go to the sky, you plot your own knowledge about the knowledge relevant to your question. So that will actually include your own bias, so you have the things that you've read and the things that you know about, or the theories you've been taught, and you will first of all plot those on your knowledge map. But because you're doing it in an action learning context with other people who are there to help you, they then will add to and enrich your sky section of the knowledge map. And you're getting access to knowledge beyond your own bounded knowledge. And that is richer, and also addresses some of the points around bias. The reason I created that knowledge map process came out of some of the early work with the action learning question method, where we were running it initially in some of the big banks, and people realized that they were doing an accredited version of action learning questions. It was linked to a master's degree, and they had to tackle their action learning question around a real business related issue. And what people were doing was sort of saying, well, I think I've got a bit of theory now relevant to my question. And he'd say, well, what is that theory? Oh, it's from this book that I read. I really love the book. Well, how did you actually access the book? Well, I saw it at the airport and on the, in the bookshop, and it kind of caught my eye and I liked the title, and, then I agree with a whole lot of stuff in it. So, okay, what role does that book have in influencing your decision making about how you're going to tackle your question or how you're going to be? And is it just reflecting your own pre-existing interests? So that's why we created the discipline, really, of the knowledge mapping process. And I see some remarkable kind of knowledge maps that have been created. And in the civil service, for instance, and government departments, about 2,000 people have been through the action learning question process now, through the work of a consultancy called Maven. And I've been involved with that throughout the whole process the last 10 years. And they create these remarkable maps of creatively, created, of the bodies of knowledge that might be relevant to research. But you're always, with action learning, starting on the ground. You're not starting in the sky and saying, right, let's read a whole lot of stuff on culture or on change, and then, hopefully find a theory that I can then go and apply in my organization. You're starting on the ground with the real challenge, here and now challenge, and looking at how it presents itself, consulting with your action learning set to get some kind of, inspiration and some views and some support. You're then experimenting, taking some action, and maybe going through several cycles of action learning within ALQ over a sort of 3-month period, typically, in order to, I would say, not problem solve. I mean, often people talk about action learning as a problem solving method.
No, I don't see it as problem solving myself. I see it as much bigger than that. And Richard, where I'm kind of curious, the wonderful example that you've given in the civil service, and for someone who may not be so familiar with action learning questions, how did that process in terms of work? For example, how long did the action learning within the civil service in that example carry on? How many people were in the group? And what was the output at the end?
Yeah. Well, to give you a flavor for that, I mean, this was like related to a specific professional field, I would describe it as, within the civil service, which was organization design and development. Bear in mind, this is an organization with over 100 professions that are recognized, even as a profession for professions. So the challenges we
Complex then.
yeah, so complex, multifaceted, and lots of expertise. So linked to our earlier discussion about how difficult it can be when you're there in your job, expected to know the answers and to give your expertise, difficult to flick into a kind of sort of, an action learning mode and parking your knowledge, trading your ignorance. But this particular professional field of organization development needed to support people, often shifting from a role where they were subject matter experts or process experts around aspects of change or HR, and enabling them to become more like internal consultants, really, and relating to their clients and their business partners, etc. So, yeah, I mean, what happened in that specific example is cohorts typically set up with 12 to 14 people. They would then work in be divided into two action learning sets. They would be working on their individual action learning question or organization development question or practice-based learning question, called various things. So they would be working on that over typically in that example, a kind of 5-6 month period, and they would be supporting each other in a learning set to first of all define their question. And that's an iterative process. It's not just picking a question off a list. It's actually going out and discussing the question with clients and stakeholders, articulating it, and then doing some research around it, knowledge mapping in the way I described, taking action, and all the while coming back to the learning set for support. In that particular program, also being really quite reflective in looking at self as an instrument of change, etc. And they would then keep a journal and they write up an account of their learning, and it would be accredited. So a few years ago, we did a big evaluation impact review, and that's been published in a couple of articles. You might want to kind of provide a link to those at the end of the podcast or subsequently. So that demonstrated impact both through some qualitative and quantitative data that was generated. But the interesting thing with action learning is each problem is unique. So it's kind of not appropriate, I would argue, to be sort of constantly in search of some normative data that will actually prove the benefit of it. That's the way, particularly in training and the learning field, we've historically gone, but without being able to do it because it's difficult to prove, the direct impact in terms of quantitative data at that sort of fourth level of Kirkpatrick's model. So, action learning for me is about, recognizing you're dealing with unique problems and challenges for people and organizations. They're relevant, they're contemporary, they're future focused. And so we require, with an action learning question, the participants who are doing one to build into their scoping of their question these success criteria. So through discussion with their stakeholders, they start to kind of draw out, well, I think success will look like this. You will have, there may be some quantitative measures. It may be, reflected in people survey results, but it may equally be qualitative, and it may be about what we're able to observe in terms of change that's happened. So there are kind of, lots of examples of this. And equally in other organizations where we've used the method and developed action learning facilitators for change, there have been kind of direct kind of correlations between the introduction of action learning questions and action learning facilitators across the business with a business objective in terms of, hard data, so a childcare organization, Bright Horizons, that's been written up in an article, again, which we can share, demonstrated direct impact between the interventions and the method, with their results in terms of health and safety recognition, Ofsted reports, etc. And more importantly, the creation of an organisation where everybody recognised their responsibility in keeping every child safe in all of their nurseries. So, there's various types of evidence of impact, but they tend to be unique to the sector or the organisation, depending on what their objectives were.
Before we continue, I'd love to invite you to visit my website, where you'll find more resources to support your personal and professional journey. Whether you're exploring leadership development, coaching, supervision, or inclusive workplaces, you can go and visit there for deeper reflections to help you to grow. You'll find everything at nitasharma.com. It's also the best place to connect with me directly and discover what's coming up. And of course, there are all the back catalogue episodes of podcasts that you can tap into and gain lots of wisdoms and reflections. So in building on that, Richard, what are some of the kind of core skills does a person develop going through an action learning process or facilitation? Because I hear, the objectives that you're giving in terms of the civil service or the horizon. What do individuals walk away with personally?
Yeah, personally, I mean, you can talk about skills, and to me, that's the easy bit. It's a bit like with coaching. I see action learning, coaching, and mentoring, for that matter, as learning relationships. And to do it well, usually there is a kind of a consistent kind of value that drives people to do coaching, mentoring, or action learning. But to do it well, you need those core skills. So you need to be good at questioning, you need to be good at listening, you need to be good at reflecting. But for me, those are the easy things. Well, they're easy to teach in terms of saying this is how you do it. Yes, that was a leading question. No, that was a good open question. That's kind of basic stuff. Doing it in real time, in practice, with real problems in the room is more challenging, as we previously discussed, because of our prior learning and training. So yes, I think people who have gone through the action learning question method and the action learning facilitator accreditation could say at the end of it, yes, I'm better at listening now. I'm listening at a deeper level, not just listening to the words. I'm listening to the emotions. I'm listening to what might be going on underground. I'm questioning at a deeper level in order to help problem holders understand their own context and their own choices. So you'd expect good coaches to do that as well. You'd expect good mentors to do it, and you'd expect good action learning facilitators to do all that. So I think there's that, there's skill stuff. And equally, I would say at a deeper level, what do people learn? What do they get from it? What are the skills? It's not necessarily a skill, but actually working with their ignorance, working with what I don't know. You know, that's something that's hard to teach somebody. You kind of have to go through the experience of recognizing how you're conditioned not to do that, to then work out how to do it. There's that level of learning as well. And I think, you know, often a kind of what they're taking away, what they're leaving the program with is a discipline and a methodology that enables them when they face a business or organizational or team or personal challenge to say, okay, right, let's do a quick sort on that. Is it a puzzle or a problem? If it's a problem, okay, I've now got a method I can use. Is this appropriate to bring together people, maybe across teams or from my team, or people with a common interest to do some action learning? And in which case, you know, it's horses for courses. You use the right method for the type of problem or challenge that you're facing. Is it puzzle? Is it a problem? If it's a puzzle, you don't need action learning. It's the wrong method to use. You need the training course, you need the expert, you need the process. You know, go to that, or AI might be able to help you.
Yeah, interesting, because I'm trying to sort of look at in my mind around problem solving and jigsaw, or puzzle.
Organ puzzle.
I heard as a jigsaw, but I suppose it's a puzzle as well.
Yeah.
And then I'm thinking maybe one is around fitting things in, or that there is a right. What puzzles are about that, aren't there? There's a puzzle shape for the right part of the puzzle.
Yep.
Whereas I think the problem solving part is infinite, because you eventually have to kind of reduce it, because as you said,
Yes.
with the scientists,
Yeah.
who did it in the 30s, you can stay at that cognitive level at 32,000 degrees up in the air and never do something with it. And personally, I've come across enough leaders in the world who've done that, who don't then translate it to a more granular level. And I guess the methodology or the action learning question is about bringing that down to more granular action level as well. And I love the phrase, trading your ignorance. That's the starting point, isn't it? It's about going, when I don't know what I don't know.
Yeah.
And I'm willing to
Yeah.
stay in that space and the discomfort
Yeah.
of exploring that.
Yeah.
Now, tell me a little bit about your postgraduate certificate in action learning certificate.
Yeah, sure. So, 25 years ago, created the method called action learning questions, which I've talked a bit about. So you can take any leadership problem or challenge or professional challenge and apply the action learning question method. Had that accredited over the last 25 years by various business schools, universities in the UK and around the world, Australia and the US. Quite soon after creating the method within a particular action learning business school at the time, where Revans had been the inaugural president, I was asked to work on the method that they were using and created action with others. We created the action learning question approach. Soon after creating it, realized actually to make this work on a wider scale than just us going around facilitating all of the action learning question programs, we needed to create a number of facilitators of action learning who were trained in, and experienced in the key principles of good practice as facilitators of action learning? My observation back then when we were designing the action learning facilitator program was that a lot of the programs on the market focused on just the most visible aspect of action learning, which is the learning set coming together. So understandably, that was the focus. So how do you actually run a learning set meeting? And I realized when I went back to the origins of action learning, the original theory and how it's developed, that actually there were other kind of key facilitation qualities that were or activities that were really important. I called them modes eventually of action learning facilitation. So they are that not just working with sets and creating sets out of nowhere, disconnected with the organizational systems. You actually need to focus on how do you mobilize action learning within organizations or across organizations or within society or within education, wherever you're doing it, you somehow need to mobilize it. And there are some people who are really good at mobilizing. So they're able to influence key people, they're able to embed it in the existing system, they can link it to the organizational strategy, can do all those sorts of things. So we made that one of the key aspects of the action learning facilitator program. They have to do the action learning set stuff as well and have to be a good action learning or learning catalyst. So, it's a role that I aim to perform quite a lot at the moment is saying, okay, I see we've now created action learning sets in the business sector here. We're now doing it in the higher education sector. How can we connect the two and create some synergy and make, a bigger impact? And so that's about being a learning catalyst. So there's those three modes really, and those are at the heart of the Alpha program. People go through a program over a period of months. They work out. For me, it's the principle that if you're going to use the method and teach other people to do action learning questions, they need to be able to say to you, well, have you done one yourself? I've done one, and this is my action learning question. It was this. So they have to do it. They have to work as facilitators in a learning set, sharing each other's problems and challenges as action learning facilitators, and over a period of months, go through those cycles of working out what my question is, doing some research around it, doing something for real with their clients or with their organization, and then reflecting on their learning and providing evidence of that. And that journey, which is a personal reflective journey as well as an external practical journey, is evidenced at postgraduate level. And ultimately, through a great partnership that we have with York St John University London campus in the Docklands, they are able to achieve a postgraduate certificate in action learning facilitation. So it's a unique qualification that we've created at postgrad cert level now. Yeah.
Great. Sounds fantastic, actually. And finally, just kind of rounding up things, what are some of the key nuggets can you share that are essential to make action learning methodology work?
It's a good question. I think the biggest thing I would pick out is if you're trying to do this in a corporate or organizational setting, probably any setting actually, is sponsorship. So, in an organizational context, often there are other things going on. There's sort of standard training. There's sometimes still sort of sheep dip training where everybody has to do the XYZ course, in the hope that that's going to change things in terms of the culture and behavior. So there's all that kind of noise to sort of contend with if you're trying to put it into an organization. You need high level sponsorship with somebody who has understood it and got it. And, you nurture that sponsorship and keep, key players within an organization engaged in the process. So it does not become, an adjunct to existing soft skills courses. That's not, to me, it's not my version of action learning. It's business driven, and so the key nugget, I suppose, is with business driven action learning, which I subscribe to, is work out with the organization or the client what are the business challenges. Start from there and use that as the basis for setting up some really good action learning projects. There are two ways of doing that. You either have people who are all bringing their own personal action learning question to a learning set and helping each other on that, or they're working with a strategic challenge that has been negotiated and agreed, with the organization, with sponsors, to say, right, we really need people now looking at certain sort of changes that we know are going to be hitting us, or threats that we might be facing into the future. So could we actually have some people in a group learning set working on that same challenge? So in effect, what you're kind of creating organizationally is your own people working as a research entity within your body, within your own organization. So those are the two ways of doing it.
Great. I've certainly have seen that in an organization where I was doing some work around, this is about 10 years ago, around embedding inclusive leadership through having the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we were learning, we were bringing action learning sessions. And one of the things I noticed, apart from, and I probably didn't have the language as you're describing, what I did notice was that through the group work that was done, it enabled the individual to have some confidence to be able to tackle at the micro level some of their questions and behaviors back into the workplace. And I think this is where I saw the strength where action learning can be a very powerful tool for people.
That's a great example. I mean, the whole, area of, equity, diversity, inclusion. I've seen learning sets and individuals using the action learning question approach to work on the challenges within their organization. And it kind of, it goes beyond the kind of concept that EDI is about making sure everybody understands the rules and the regulations, the codes of practice, and they can quote what the protected characteristics are, etc. Which doesn't on its own necessarily change behavior. So my action learning approach to this has been to say, can you work on what are the real challenges? Start on the ground. So what are the real challenges that you currently see going on? Let's get enough trust in the group to be able to discuss these, subject to contracting within the group about, what we do with the data sharing. But can we examine the real situations and cases and what's going on? Then we can look at it in the context of the sky. And in the sky, you've got the regulations and the rules and the law and all of that. But you start on the ground.
Yeah. Along with the underground as well, Richard.
Massively. In that example, massively underground, because, of course, as you'll know, there'll be things that people won't want to discuss, or they might home and discuss with their partner, their friends, but they don't want to discuss in the organizational structure where they're part of the organization and part of the, the power structures and the political dynamics as well. So, yeah, absolutely. So working with the underground, making it legitimate to talk about those things and, with a constructive purpose to work out how you can bring some of those underground factors from underground to the surface and so that people can talk about them is really important.
Now, I think that's on our second podcast in that, Richard. So maybe we'll pause it there because I think we're probably giving away the shiny gold in our process. So thank you so much for walking us through. And I think that just, the word that came to my mind just is so much wisdom in what you're sharing and the benefits to individuals and organization for having this kind of methodology.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, Nita, and the kind words. Be happy to discuss further, maybe in a follow-up. Anybody who's listening, you I think will be sort of, showing the links and the websites and whatever. Feel free to kind of connect and individually or organizationally, and we can discuss how the whole approach might be relevant for you.
Lovely. I'm sure they will. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nita.
Thank you for spending this time with me today. I hope the conversation gave you something valuable to reflect on as you move through your week. Reaching Minds is all about supporting your growth, expanding your awareness, and helping you navigate life with more clarity and confidence. If today's episode resonated with you, make sure you subscribe or follow the podcast so you never miss an update. I would also love to hear your thoughts, questions, or reflections. You can leave me a voice message at speakpipe.com/Nita Sharma. I listen to every message and often weave your insights into future episodes. Thank you again for joining me. Until next time, take good care of yourself and keep reaching for the ideas and perspectives that help you to grow.